A camp without walls. Un campo senza muri. As children, how are we to know that we too were part of something that happened so long ago and so far away? It was a dark, gloomy day in Boston. And what is so unusual about this? It's usually a dark, gloomy day in Boston. My father's nurse from Massachusetts General Hospital called to tell us that the cardiologist wanted to talk to us since my father was not doing well. No surprise, Salvatore Lombardo was between life and death. He had had problems with his bypass surgery and medication thereafter. Dozing in and out of consciousness, he whispered to me, "Go home and get my papers in the attic." In my search, I climbed into the attic, and there a metal box tumbled onto the floor. It had been wrapped in a pillowcase and tied with strings. What was this? I discovered my father's diary, a description of his life as an Italian soldier and where he had traveled. He had been in Greece. A Greek woman? What? Letters between my father and a woman fell from the stack. Unbelievable. They were addressed, "Dear Father," "Dear Daughter." What did that mean? I had a sister? There was more to the story, I was sure. This was too much for me to handle all at once. My siblings had to know as well. I would not say anything until my father improved. Today I come to you in the memory of two men. Salvatore Lombardo, my father and mentor, and Eva Herzer, my friend and mentor. I'm here to humbly serve as the conduit, for their stories are burning to be told. I was caught in the middle of a rescuer who did not feel it was important to relate what he had done, and a man who was rescued and wanted to pay tribute. All I had known about my father's experience was that he had survived World War II, but was filled with guilt. In fact, in moments of reprieve, Primo Levi's words are so applicable. Dopo di allora, ad ora incerta, since then, at an uncertain hour, the agony returns. Go away. I haven't dispossessed anyone. No one died in my place. It's not my fault I live and breathe. My father was tormented by the guilt of his past, having lived while others died. He was one of two survivors of a Nazi slave labor camp. The camp that he was in did not have barbed wire because it was a temporary camp to be used as long as the Nazis needed oars to be extracted for their arms. The camp was encircled by German Shepherd dogs, which chose to widen or restrict the camp parameters on their own whim. My father suffered a bullet wound to his leg. The physical scars healed, but the psychological scars remained with him for life, constantly interrupting his sleep, forcing him to cry out in agony as he dreamt of the anguish in fighting with German Shepherd dogs to get scraps of meat on Fridays. This was entertainment for the Nazis. In his dreams, guns were pointed to his head, but bullets would not come out. He was a strong man by day who worked hard on stilts to perform an art of antique plastering. At night, he was reduced to a whimpering man as though he was being tortured. Often we would be disturbed from our sleep, and we would stand in the doorway to his bedroom, where my mother would serve as a guard, meeting us and hushing us, not to awaken our father, for fear that he would be startled into a heart attack. So we listened and watched, and the next day we said nothing. I repeat, as children, how are we to know that we too were part of something that happened so long ago and so far away? I'm sure the Nazis would have delighted in the fact that they would torment generations to come of the men they had enslaved. In fact, both my children and my sister's children have difficulty sleeping because she and I would check in on them so frequently that they always suspected that something would happen at night. Holidays for my family were torture, with my father's guilt at its worst. We were not allowed to sing or be cheerful and laugh. We had to mourn with him. Similar to other survivors, he had compulsive behavior, the urgency to get things done right, away. Worrisome nights with impending evil lurking in the night. Continual guilt about having to achieve every minute of your life for the sake of progress. Distrust of others and their motives for doing things. And insecurity about any permanence in life, stemming from the fact that he had watched his friends die. He had blocked everything for years, except the fact he would make exaggerated statements to us. That did not seem to make sense. Do your homework. You only have one chance in life. As he related his story, I understood that he almost died on numerous occasions, and each time he either learned to cope with his surroundings or he would have been killed. My siblings and I had constant pressure to achieve because he threatened that we would return to Italy. He kept a suitcase out as a reminder. So every report card, my brother and I would compare grades and urge the other on to get A's and B's for fear that we would leave America. He talked about us lifting our heads out of the water, progressing with our education, just like they talk about breaking the glass ceiling for women. Then he would say, we are immigrants to this country, and we have to assimilate to become Americans in order to survive. I couldn't imagine that we would actually die if we did not assimilate, but in learning his story, I realized that if he had not disguised himself as a Greek, he would have been killed. He would tell us that in our home, we were totally Italians, and outside of our home, we had to be totally Americans. Thank goodness for the balance my mother provided with her cheerful disposition. Education to him was the most important factor. It is the only thing that no one can take away from you. The Nazis stripped him of his uniform and worldly possessions, but they could not take away his knowledge and thinking. He was willing to sell his house when it came time for his fourth child to be educated. Fortunately, he didn't have to do so, but that gives you an idea of his commitment to education. This is the baggage that I carried. Have you ever met someone who has changed your life by helping you learn about yourself? Oftentimes, we allow that to happen because we have a predisposition, if you will, and are magnetized to that person and ideas based on our past. My brother and husband met a man at Georgetown Visitation in D.C. who had spoken for the Italian Cultural Society about the Italians in World War II. They sent him to meet with me. So in 1986, a frail Jewish man came to the National Italian American Foundation in Washington, D.C., where I was working as the education director. He told me he had a compelling story to tell that he had promised to his father on his deathbed that if they survived the war, he, Ivo Herzer, would tell the story and pay tribute to the Italians. He told me that during World War II, his family was in Zagreb, Croatia, where the Ustasha was rounding up Jewish families for the Nazis to take to Auschwitz. However, his family escaped persecution because an officer in the Italian army hid them in a truck and took them to the Italian zone and allowed them to enter Italy. Ivo was sure that numerous Italians had rescued Jews in Italy and outside of Italy, so this was the story he wished to relate to the world. There was one more point. Ivo was dying of cancer, so telling the story was an urgent matter. As he spoke, I had flashbacks of my own father, screaming excruciating shrills in the night, overpowered by nightmares, and our mother hushing us. There was little explanation except for the fact that my father had been imprisoned and tortured by the Nazis. My father had been in Maketika, Yugoslavia, the same area mentioned by the visitor to my office. After my meeting with Mr. Herzer, that same evening I telephoned my father and asked his opinion. His response had been, "It's important that you help that man." Somehow, I felt that I was embarking on a journey that started in 1986 and that I am continuing today. Little did I know that helping Mr. Herzer fulfill his promise to his father would lead me to understand and discover my father's past. Frankly, 2 missions were fulfilled. Mission 1. As a daughter and educator, through research of his travels, I learned my father's story and Italy's role during World War II. It was easy to learn from the history books, but the challenge was to get my father's story. He kept telling me to look ahead, forget the past. I threatened that I would not speak to him if he did not help me understand his diary. After some months of not speaking to him, he came to Washington, D.C., where I was living, and he related his story.
Un giorno esce sul giornale che tutte le italiane che siamo dispersi in tutta la Grecia di presentarci a un certo punto, e specialmente io che ero a Patrasso.
He was an Italian soldier in the aeronautics who was sent to North Africa, and with Mussolini's quest for power, his troop eventually ended up in Greece. There they were stationed at Araxos Airport in Patras. The officers took over the villas near the ocean, and my father was a master chef for them. Many Greeks volunteered to help him cook in exchange for food. So in the evening, he distributed food to the poor Greeks. It was during this time that Agro and her sisters worked for my father. He fell in love with Agro. When Mussolini's government fell on September 8, 1943, the planes left and the soldiers were disbanded to choose their own fates. This story is well documented in the film Mediterraneo. My father was given the option to join the Nazis and make his life easy, but he refused, not believing in their barbaric acts. So he risked his life becoming a partisan in the international resistance movement against the Nazis. As a resistance fighter, he fought for human rights and for the stopping oppression of innocent people. The partisans were at high risk as the most hated by the Nazis because they were unpredictable and used guerrilla warfare tactics such as blowing up roads and bridges. My father disguised himself as a Greek with the name Christos Apostopoulos and even worked for the Nazis. He was harbored by the family of Agro, the Greek woman he had fallen in love with. He tried desperately to marry her, but the papas would not marry them, telling them to wait until the end of the war. They had a child, Elena. At the end of the war, he went back to find Elena's mother, but she had married to give Elena a name, since it was difficult for a woman to have a child out of wedlock and raise a child out of wedlock. It was not until 40 years later that I invited Elena to my wedding. She was united with my father, and they communicated in Greek. She spoke no Italian and no English, yet she was at our head table. You can imagine how the Italian relatives reacted. "Why isn't my daughter at the head table? Who's that woman?" She was a thread to our laden past. My father was lured by an Italian fascist priest, a Nazi sympathizer, who wrote in a Greek newspaper that if the Italian partisans would not come forth, the Nazis would burn the homes of the Greeks that harbored them. The Nazis, using tactics of Waldheim, who later became Secretary General in the 80s, of the United Nations in the 80s, provided forms to the soldiers as to where they wished to go. Did they want to go back to Italy? Did they want to work in the Italian-occupied territories? Over 255 men came forth, only to be taken in cattle trains to a Nazi slave labor camp, Makatika Valesina Rid in southern Yugoslavia. There the partisans were subjected to atrocities. He survived along with Giuseppe Sorrentino, the only 2 out of 255 men to return to Italy. My father was freed by the Serbs under Tito's command, and he joined the Serbs to fight against the Nazis. The Serbs were responsible for saving the lives of thousands of Jews. Similarly to many other survivors, the horrors of the past have affected them and their entire families for generations to come. Even though my father had been freed from the camp walls of the dogs remained in his mind, encircling and depressing his psychological being. Also, think for a moment, your reaction to your worst enemy. How far would your hatred carry you? Would you avenge yourself, or would you pity your enemy and walk away? I could not understand how my father, when finally freed from the slave labor camp, equipped with a gun, would not shoot the Nazis, but only spit at them, saying, "You were lions yesterday, but what are you today?" Sometimes the long-lasting effects of war are often neglected. In addition to physical problems, post-traumatic stress syndrome, alcoholism, and depression, as we witnessed, are the real effects of wars on survivors and families. In spite of his problems, he was serious, he was quiet, read a great deal, both in Italian and English, in English. He liked newspapers. He was a loner. He didn't have many friends outside of the family. But he never gave up, always thought the future provided hope through young people. Salvatore was an ordinary man that had done extraordinary things, but he did not feel that he had done anything out of the ordinary. Helping others was just what anyone would have done. He felt akin to the Jews and lived in a Jewish community. When the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum wished to interview him, he said no to the publicity. He did not want cameras, but was happy to share his story in the book that I prepared at Camp Without Walls. I must share with you my initial trepidation in preparing this book. Where would I start? I pondered for a long time, with people telling me that I should begin with something that was familiar. In this case, I had to bridge World War II with the present, and that was no easy task. Then one day, while I was in Boston, I was near Massachusetts General Hospital, and it struck me that my father's heart attack was something I was familiar with. My father's doctor had instructed us to talk to my father when he was in his subconscious state about the past in an attempt to bring him to the present. Thus, I structured the book with chapters of family members telling my father their feelings toward him and their forthright attitudes about how he had affected all of us. A Camp Without Walls is divided into the personal story, historical research about Italy's role during World War II, the Italian rescues of Jews, an annotated bibliography, list of resources, and a guide for others to conduct conferences. My dream is to have a film about the book. I already have a treatment and a script. Most people would have written a book and then conducted conferences. Instead, I conducted conferences and then wrote the book, because people thought, hearing the story, that I should write it and share it. My second mission, as an educator, I satisfied my intellectual curiosity. The true story about Italy had to be told. How could it be that my father, an Italian soldier under Mussolini, fought against the Nazis? In the American school curriculum, we learned that Italy was aligned with Germany, the Nazis, and when the American Allies arrived in 1943, Italy switched sides. Why did the Italians go against the Nazis to help the Jews? How could it be? The Italians were on the side of the Germans. More confusion. Conferences were probably the best vehicle to address the issues and reach the public. However, in my own naivete, I was not prepared for the resistance from our own Italians. Initially, the idea was not well received by the Italian community at NIAF, noting that because of the controversy around Pope Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, the Italian story would be regarded in a negative light. After many discussions, it was agreed that the project would begin only if I raised funds. When I approached the National Endowment for the Humanities, I was advised that the proposal had to tell a balanced story. The idea was to discuss the positive rescue of the Jews by the Italians, but the story had to be furthered by presenting information about negative aspects, describing the Jews that were not rescued. So I expanded the topic to the Holocaust in Southern Europe. NEH did not want a group of Italians to pat each other on the back. Interestingly, it was the Jews who would pat the Italians on their backs, as we encountered survivors nationally. When I wrote the proposal with assurances that the program would be scholarly, inviting renowned scholars from Canada, France, Italy, Germany, and Israel, I was funded for over $200,000, and the first international conference was held at Boston University, my alma mater. To date, 45 conferences and events on the Holocaust in Southern Europe have occurred in cities across the U.S., from Boston to Los Angeles. A conference was held in the Cleveland, Ohio area with a collaboration between the Jewish and Italian community. In Washington, D.C., at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, but one of the most important was held at the Lincoln Theater in D.C., sponsored by 18 federal agencies, the Department of State, Defense, Treasury, and on and on. Years later, an international conference on Italy and the Holocaust, the Calabria Connection, was held at UMass Boston. The conferences were structured with lectures about the history, survivors' testimonies, and panel discussions with community leaders of various ethnic groups discussing the moral lessons derived from the Holocaust. Clearly, there was a message. Ask yourselves, who would you be? A perpetrator, a rescuer, or a bystander? If you witnessed someone being attacked in your grocery store, not in Newton, of course, it's the safest city in America, who would you be? One who joins the fight against the victim, the perpetrator, someone who jumps in to help be a rescuer, or someone who watches, a bystander? What are the consequences of each choice? We need to really understand what it means to stand up for a wrong. The Greeks that harbored the Italians and the Italians that harbored Jews were in danger of serious consequences, with the Nazis not hesitating to burn their homes, placing themselves and their families at risk. The Italians, according to Jewish survivors, were rescuers, and many paid with their lives. Clearly, Jewish survivors expressed that their families had no money, no jewels to give. The Italians helped them out of love for humanity, no other reason. In my book, I describe the history of Jews in Italy that dates back to Roman times. Interestingly, the popes never expelled the Jews from Rome, that had the oldest Jewish community in Europe, over 2,000 years old. In the 1400s, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, many ended up in southern Italy and adopted Italian names of locations such as Ponte, Napoli, Lombardia, and they became part of Italian society. Although Jews were forced to live in ghettos for centuries, during 1870, the emancipation, they were freed, afforded the rights of Italian citizens, and they could aspire to higher ranking positions. Prior to World War II, there were Jews who were generals in the Italian army, and because the Italians were used to working with them, there was a sense of mutual respect. This may explain the benevolence and sympathy toward Jews by the Italian army. The other reason may be that the Jews worked in the professions of doctors, teachers, and officials, which allowed the Italian public to relate to them as neighbors and friends. From World War I up to 1938, there was little reason for the Jews to feel any risk in Italy. In 1938, there were 47,000 Italian Jews out of a population of 45 million. About 10,000 were foreign Jews. Many Jews had served in the First World War, and they were ingrained in the Italian society. In fact, while Jews in the other countries of Europe were concerned about Hitler's Nazis, The Jews in Italy seemed to be little affected. It was during this period that many foreign Jews immigrated to Italy. The Jews were further assured by Mussolini, who was appointed prime minister by Victor Emmanuel III in 1922, that there was no Jewish problem in Italy. In fact, Mussolini had Jewish mistresses, one Margherita Sarfatti and Russian Angelika Blalbanov, who was his biographer and mistress. He spoke in favor of accepting the Jewish intelligentsia into the Italian culture. Hitler admired Mussolini and even copied his style, which was modeled after the Roman pomp for warfare with the specific uniforms. However, the ideologies of Mussolini and Hitler were different, with Mussolini wanting to expand Italy's territory, and Hitler, in addition to land, wanted an Aryan race by the systematic destruction of Jews, gypsies, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. To show Hitler that he was his comrade and would follow orders, one can only imagine the shock when Mussolini took two measures against the Jews. The first measure was the racial laws of 1938, stating Jews did not belong to the pure Italian race, and stripping the Jews of their professions and forcing their children out of schools. Intermarriage between the Jews and non-Jews was prohibited. The Garden of Finzi-Contini illustrates this period. The Jews no longer enjoyed the rights and privileges of Italian ordinary citizens. In 1939, preempting problems, intellectuals such as Enrico Fermi and the Segre families came to the U.S. But for the most part, because Jews had felt so accepted in Italy, they were even less prepared for the Nazi death machine that swept throughout northern Italy in 1943. After Italy became an occupied territory, 6,801 Jews were deported to death camps. According to a Libro della Memoria, we see the deportation from Italy in Robert Benigni's film, Life is Beautiful. I called the Jewish Documentation Center after seeing the movie in Milan and asked my friend, the director, Liliana Picciotto-Farjon, the name of the camp. She told me it was an imaginary camp. The second measure that Mussolini took was the establishment of internment camps throughout Italy for the confinement of foreign Jews that arrived in Italy. One such camp, built in 1940 by the fascist regime, was located in Calabria near Ferramonte di Tarsia, a malaria-infested area. There are about 15 others in southern Italy. Within the camp, 1,400 to about 4,000 German, Pole, Hungarian, and Yugoslavian Jews were allowed to set up a cooperative kitchen, a library, a synagogue, schools, a medical care unit, and a recreation center. Some of the survivors recalled having weddings. The Ferramonte Foundation, according to Simona Celebretti, has recorded extensively on the camp and stated that the policy of the camp was tolerance and respect, as long as the Jews maintained discipline and order. Today, the camp has many of the original barracks, but a road was built in the middle of the camp. Can you imagine? Eventually, the camp was freed by the Allies. People in other camps, such as Fossoli near Carpi in northern Italy, were not as lucky, because as mentioned, in 1943, the Jews in this camp were sent to Auschwitz. However, the Germans also set up a camp, La Risiera, complete with a crematorium near Trieste, for executing about 3,000 partisans and 50 Jews. It's important to discuss what happened in Southern Europe during the Holocaust because a great deal of attention has been given to Northern Europe. Due to the tremendous exposure of Spielberg's Schindler's List, in contrast to Northern Europe, we see bureaucrats working within the bureaucracy to save Jews. Just as the Nazi death machine could not have operated efficiently without collaborators, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Ukrainians, the Hungarians, the French, and the Croatians, rescue efforts could not have taken place without the collaboration of those willing to risk their lives, such as the Italians, Albanians, Bulgarians, who saved their own Jews but turned over foreign Jews to the Germans. Italian efforts were evident in Italy and the Italian-occupied territories as well, of southern France, Albania, Croatia, and Greece. The Italian experience is unique in that the Italians were sympathetic not only to their own Jews, but to foreign Jews as well. Italian bureaucrats, diplomats, and the Italian army defied orders to save Jews. When letters from the Nazis were sent to the Italian generals to turn over the Jews, the generals would make up excuses. There were mudslides. The bridges were down. And the Jews simply could not be deported. The Italian army saved Jews in Croatia and in southern France by even hiding them in hotels. The German foreign minister Ribbentrop in February 1943 even met Mussolini in Rome to express the severity of interference with the final solution. Many survivors, the editor of the Italian Refuge, and Imre Rocklitz, whose son Joseph produced the film The Righteous Enemy, and historians Meir Michaelis and Menachem Shalah of Israel attested to the fact that as the Ustasha in Croatia was rounding up Jews and sending them to death camps, the Italian army officials and soldiers saved Jews by getting them into Italy, such as Eva Herzer's family that we discussed. William Wolfe, at our conference in Miami Beach, reminisced that he and his family were saved by the Italian army in southern France. Italian soldiers not only gave his family provisions, but also took them into Italy and ultimately saved their lives. We can cite many examples of heroic rescue efforts, and I'll talk about some of them. Giorgio Pedlasca, an Italian businessman posing as a Spanish diplomat, falsified papers for over 10,000 Jews in Budapest. A book was published, The Banality of Goodness, describing his work. Guelfo Zamboni, the Italian consul of German-occupied Salonika, Greece, in 1943, saved over 280 Jews from being deported to Auschwitz in Poland. What he would do, he would make the Jews Italian citizens and would try to intermarry them with Italians. There were the heroic deeds of ordinary Italian citizens, priests and nuns who helped to rescue 85% of Italy's Jewish population. Susan Zuccotti points out in her book, The Italians and the Holocaust. Even after the war, Jewish refugees entered into Italy. Sarah Bloomfield, director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, invited me to a reunion of 50 doctors from all over the world who had been displaced Jews but were welcome to live in the Casa dello Studente and study at the University of Turin, where they received their medical degrees. Why did the Italians help Italian Jews? There are many theories as to why the Italians rescued Jews. Some conclude that it could have been for reasons other than altruism, the hatred of the German Nazis, or a desire to assert their sovereignty. Daniel Goldhagen, in the book The Willing Executioners, speaks of the predisposition of the German people to be anti-Semitic and the fact that Italian people were not anti-Semitic. My own recognition of the difference between the Jews in Italy and the Jews in other countries is how they perceive themselves and how others perceive them. This became apparent to me when I had the opportunity to listen to Rena Binder, a survivor from Schindler's List. As she spoke of her experience in Poland, I could not help but notice that she made reference to the fact that she and others were Jews living in Poland, and not once did she refer herself as a Polish Jew. She also stated that the reason many Jews did not resist beyond the Warsaw Ghetto was because they had nowhere to go and no one to save them. Helen Deutsch, whose family had immigrated to Italy, recounted the fact that as a young married woman living just outside of Rome, she recalled her husband taken away to an internment camp, and she, pregnant, was left behind. The Giustini family took her in and helped her with her baby. In fact, she recalled sleeping with her child on the bed while the grandfather slept on the floor. The Giustini family took care of her for 2 years. After 32 years, through our conference in Chicago, we had her reunite with a grandson, Dr. Ferdinando Giustini, whom I had met when I gave a presentation in West Virginia. The reunion was one of kinship. Marina Zinn of New Jersey remembered being a child hidden in an attorney's country home. When the Germans drew closer, her mother hid her and her brother in a convent. Only the Mother Superior knew that the children were Jewish. Marina commented she learned all the prayers in Latin, and when it came time for her to make her Holy Communion, the sisters explained that she couldn't make hers because she had to wait for her father to return from the war. When the nuns were apprised of the danger with the Nazis closing in, another Italian family hid them until the end of the war. Marina returned to Italy after 30 years to be reunited with the children of the families that rescued her. Sabina Helixer of New York City was saved by people from the Marche and Abruzzi. Her young doctor husband and she had traveled from Germany. After September 8, 1943, when the Nazis advanced through Italy, she and her young children were hidden in the mountains outside of Rome. She and her husband joined a partisan group. She was saved, but her husband was not as fortunate. He was shot by the Nazis. Her son was asked to identify the mutilated body of his father. The impression of gouged eyes, torn flesh, remained with him. This son was so affected, related Mrs. Helixer, that after he graduated with a full scholarship from Harvard University, he committed suicide in Paris. Mickey Orman of New Orleans recollected, in growing up in the U.S., her mother had spoken to a certain Cesarina Carnevale, who had saved her parents, herself, and her 9-month-old baby by being her wet nurse. Mickey remembered her mother speaking of Cesarina and how she hid them in her home in Rocca di Papa. Mickey and her family went to Italy to be reunited with the family. Mickey's most touching moment was when her mother and Cesarina spoke. Their voices bridged space and time. Women assisted in the rescue efforts in Italy and outside of Italy. There's an old Italian saying that when women take up a cause, you can assume it has been won. There were about 35,000 women, and some 5,000 were in prison, and 650 died in combat. The women were called staffettas, and children, badigli, served as messengers, as it was unsafe to communicate in any other way. My father also recalled women being strong elements of the resistance movement in Yugoslavia, both fighting alongside the men and in homes, providing shelter and harboring the resistance fighters. They were heavily armed and fought bravely along with the men, with the partisans, to push the Nazis back. Janetta Sagan, a survivor that we met at our San Francisco conference, an Italian Jewish resistance fighter, recounted of the many women involved in the resistance, either as outwardly fighting or assisting in rescue efforts. Her story was documented in the Washington Post. Janetta was known as the Topolino, or the Little Mouse. She was caught by the fascists and she was tortured, but she survived with the help of other resistance fighters. She became the chairperson of Amnesty International, a movement to help oppressed people throughout the world. That was her way of paying back society for her survival. She was honored with the highest Medal of Freedom by President Clinton. Nonantala is a heartwarming, sentimental story. In this town, Dr. Moriali and Father Don Arrigo Beccari, whom I traveled to see many years later, rescued 109 Jewish orphans who were brought to Italy from Germany by DELASAM, the Delegazione Assistenza ai Migranti Ebrei, a Jewish organization that assisted in the rescue of Jews. When the Nazis were closing in on the town, Father Beccari took the children from Villa Emma and asked the people of the town to hide them. The children were eventually taken to safety in Switzerland. These aforementioned survivors had one thing in common. Their families had immigrated into Italy from Poland, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Germany to escape from the Nazis. They are living testimonies that the people of Italy reached out a hand to save their lives. They clearly expressed that their families had no money, no jewels to give. The Italians helped them out of love for humanity, no other reason. Since Southern Europe has not been publicized in the past, people were not sensitized to the idea of rescue. We thank Schindler's List for the awareness of rescue it has created. More specifically, the reason that the Italian rescue efforts have not been well publicized may relate to the fact that the Italians themselves have not taken an initiative to do so for various reasons. One, they did not feel that what they had done was remarkable. As many of the rescuers put it, it was just the right thing to do. The Italian government may have been ashamed to have had its leader, Mussolini, side with the Nazis, in spite of the fact that the ideologies of Mussolini and Hitler were different. This research has been continuous. There is the issue of the Vatican. Many feel that the Vatican should not have been non-committal and should have issued a decree to protect the Jews. Others feel that if the Pope had issued any type of decree, that the Vatican would not protect the Jews when fewer rescues would have taken place because the priests and nuns would not have defied the Pope. In the book Death in Rome, Robert Katz makes a statement about Pope Pius XII's reticence in 1944 during the Ardeatine Caves massacre, when the German SS avenged 33 German soldiers killed by the partisans with the reprisal murder of 335 men and boys. 5 were just for the fun. Sister Margherita Marchioni, in the book Yours is a Precious Witness, argues that the Pope encouraged the opening of the doors by clergy to help the Jews. Ronald J. Ricklick, an attorney, confirmed in his book, Hitler, the War, and the Pope, that the Pope sent letters to nuncios and clergy to help those around unjustly treated by the Nazis. He sent letters by hand to bishops to open the convents and monasteries as a refuge for the Jewish people. Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer home, sheltered 500 Jews, and 5,000 Jews were protected in Catholic church buildings. In 1945, the Israeli consul in Italy expressed that the Holy See, the nuncios, and the entire Catholic Church saved 400,000 Jews. Pius hoped his neutrality would prevent the Nazis from overtaking the Vatican. What happened during World War II is a sensitive issue because many Italians were fascists. Why is it important to discuss World War II today? Learning about our past helps us make informed decisions about our future. Abe Foxman, former director of the ADL, eloquently stated that you would think that so many years after the war, we would not need to emphasize humanitarianism. But with the death of over 20 million people, Bosnia, Ethiopia, Darfur, for example, currently with the rise of racism and anti-Semitism, we need to open the dialogue once more. But have we learned anything from the past to help us with our future? A possible answer is to start with the children, educating them about people's commonalities while teaching them to respect differences, as they are taught about cultures and historical backgrounds. Take our example as Italian Americans. At one time or another, we have been struck by our differences, our strong family ties that probably support the growth of Verizon, our obsession with family sessions during our everlasting meals with everyone speaking at once, loudly, with all the enthusiasm one can muster. These could easily put the psychologists out of business. Our pride in hard work and achievement allowing us to ignore social services, and our awe and recognition of our community leaders. Perhaps it is our qualities of closeness and caring that make us humanitarians. But all along, we have also been concerned about our negative stereotypes and how to combat these. Our Italian-American organizations have pondered, debated, protested, and argued against negativism, but to no avail. The Godfather, The Sopranos are alive and well. In combating the negative stereotypes of Italians as mafia figures, Solely complaining about The Sopranos is not the answer. Educating the public about who we are as Italians and our great story of humanitarianism as told by the Jews about our predecessors is the way to eradicate mafia heroes and reenact the real heroes, rescuers who risked their lives and their families' lives to save others. We have the opportunity to embark on a positive mission to educate the public about Italy's role during World War II and in the rescue of Jews. During World War II, while 80% of the Jews perished all over Europe, in Italy and Italian-occupied territories, 80 to 85% of the Jews were rescued. What was the reason? I must tell you, as the program, The Holocaust in Southern Europe, has traveled throughout the U.S., from Boston to San Francisco, Jewish survivors who were rescued by the Italians explained that the Italians had nothing to gain, and their sole motivation was their inherent humanitarianism, altruism.